and who am I and why am I here? So philosophy aside, my name is Chris Lyons. I am Interim Associate Dean of Rare Books, Special Collections, Osler, Archives and Art, or ROAAR for short. And for those of you who haven't gotten tired of this joke, I didn't get the job because my last name was Lyons. Thank you. That was insincere, but appreciated nonetheless. Okay, we're excited here because we're looking at something which is a really fascinating collection and a growing collection, and one which I think is underrepresented, and that is material in the worlds of weaving and knitting. My favorite job is collecting material. When I was head of Rare Books and Special Collections and Osler before that, I had a dream job. I was paid money to buy books with someone else's money. And my feeling was like, that's like a drunk getting a job at a distillery. It's like, this is so wonderful. And I saw this book, which you'll be introduced to today, and it's a sample book from the late 19th century of weaving. And I thought, this is like, why this doesn't really fit in our collections as perceived at the time, but I said, this is fascinating. And I'll get it anyway. And so one of this nice confluence of things is that Jacquelyn has a fascination and an ability in this area, and she curates several of our collections. And one of them is this growing collection, and it's been wonderful because I think there's a real need and a real interest there. We've seen that in a number of our exhibitions. So we've purchased, you're going to see something we just purchased at the Toronto Antiquarian Book Fair last month as well. So it's an expanding area. It's bursting at the seams, to use a pun that I can't even take credit for because it's in my notes. So Jacquelyn, and her and April Colosimo, who has been with the McGill Library for a number of years in the sciences, but yet has a good appreciation for this, will introduce you to the art and science of weaving. And we're going to look at this pattern book as the basis of this. So we want to just say a few things first. Before I get into, I'll do the land acknowledgement because it's here and I think it's of the most important. And of course, we meet and recognize the people who traditionally been stewards of this land. And I want to just make another announcement because it's December 6th. And I also like to remember, for those of us who were alive, a really horrible day when there's the shooting at the Polytechnique. And we remember that and think of all the victims of senseless, stupid violence. Bit of housekeeping. If you're watching us online, you can chat throughout the event in the chat one and share links or ideas or things like that. We usually have a pretty robust conversation that goes along parallel to the talk, so that's always fun. Please be respectful, and to the other people who are speaking and to the people here speaking public. There'll be a Q&A after, so you can join that in person here in the room or by chat. And if you want to email questions or comments, or if you have any issues, technical or otherwise, you can email at ROAAr, ROAAR.library@mcgill.ca as well. And for those of you who are in the room, if we need to evacuate, I'm not saying you'll need to evacuate, but it's always good to point out there are emergency exits in the back of the room or the front of the room, so you'll be directed accordingly. Washrooms are out that door and down the hall, which is maybe the most important thing I'll have said today. And now I'm going to introduce the person who you came to hear speak, or one of the two, and it's Jacquelyn Sundberg, my colleague. She's the outreach librarian, so all these wonderful events that we have and the books we've published and everything like that is really done under her guidance, supervision, wisdom, and great creativity. So thank you. And she is also now taking on some roles, as well as I mentioned, in curating some of our collections that are sort of collections that are related to these areas, as well as cookbooks and various other ones. And hello, people just coming in. Thank you. Welcome. And she has a master's degree in English literature and information studies, both. And she uses her creativity and skill sets to make ROAAR collections accessible to a broader audience indeed. And her work includes publications, multimedia projects, websites, videos, podcasts, and games. So this is one talented and busy person and colleague. So with further ado, I'll introduce her.
Thanks, Chris. So, and thank you, everyone. I think actually you may have walked away with my notes, Chris. I think you walked away with my notes.
I did walk away with
If you wouldn't mind bringing those back, that would be great.
I think I didn't. Yes. That was.
So here we go. Thank you. So yes, for those of you who just joined us, we actually have the star of today's show out on display at the Frontier. We have including two books on display, including the one that Chris mentioned that was a recent acquisition at the Toronto Book Fair. But the one where I'm going to be digging into the history of and we'll be talking about in more detail today is the Weaver's Samper book, which is at the far end of the table for those of you here in person and on screen for those of you who are tuning in remotely. And thank you everyone for the enthusiasm for fiber arts. That has been a consistent thread woven through all of our fiber events for the last year. And really it's quite amazing how many puns you can make with weaving vocabulary. So I'll try and thread some in throughout the event. So what is this book? It is, in brief, a weaver sample book that was produced here in Quebec by a weaver by the name of Zéphyr Bellefleur, produced in the years of approximately 1895 to about 1900. And today, what I'm going to be sharing is what I've found on the historical context in which this book was produced, and to also try and share our understanding of how the extraordinary item, literally, as Chris mentioned, bursting at the seams, was used to understand what it is. And beyond that, I invite all of you to share in our process of kind of wading into this book, working with it, understanding and translating some of these patterns into usable weaving patterns that you could do on a cardboard loom at home, or possibly, if you have the skill, expertise, and access to a loom, on a contemporary loom as well. So with patience, we've worked through and we can identify some of the factors and the elements and calculations that went into making the specific swatches that are in this book. So let me introduce this book. I was going to play a video, but I think I'm going to skip the video because I'm afraid of the sound. So we're going to go right past that one. And we will just move along. First, I wanted to start with a little bit of context about where the origins of this Quebec tradition began. And that starts with the hand weaving tradition here in Quebec, which still survives. And I'm happy to see some people with fiber crafts in the room. And I hope that all of you at home online are crafting along with us as well. So there is a well-established tradition of hand weaving, spinning, and rug making, particularly here in Quebec. This postcard that you see on screen is one of a series of postcards that we have that early 20th century documented that tradition for the newly emerging tourist trade that started to go out on road trips out into the Gaspé and through the townships. And we have more of this series of postcards that shows the persistence of this craft even after the professionalization of the weaving industry, and particularly the cotton industry that happened at the turn of the 20th century. So one of these, there's spinning, of course. This is a more floor loom that was installed inside someone's home. And this would have been something on which you could make coverlets, possibly a rug, but you need something very sturdy and a different weight of material. And of course, the one that I haven't pictured is the one that does come to mind when you think of Quebec weaving. Of course, there's the tradition of the ceinture fléchée and those patterned and intensely colorful weaving projects that are very much a trademark of Quebec hand weaving. And there's an important collection of those textile samples actually right across the street. You can go, the McGill Museum has a rich textile collection and also some other supporting materials that give you more information about this historical industry. This one seems a little bit less comfortably installed. You'd have to be weaving in the summer. It's out in a barn or a cottage, but I welcome people to tell me more about these kinds of setups and the products that would have been used. This one's simply labeled a habitant loom. But it's something that is not far off from the frame looms that are still made right here in Quebec by Leclerc Looms, which is one of the largest domestic creators of looms for hand weaving today. This tradition, like I said, persists. Leclerc Looms and Maurice Brassard are two of the largest producers and suppliers for hand weavers in Canada. Brassard is also in the townships and creates textiles, warp, weft, and conveniently packaged for hand weavers. But I think if you visit both of their websites, it's a great trip to era of web design. That's fun to visit. I encourage you. I will send the links out afterwards if you're interested in exploring local producers. There's one. Le Centre des Textiles Contemporains du Québec also educates and fosters weaving and textile arts here. And now this tradition also persists in guilds. Local guilds of hand weavers exist across the city and across the province. And there are experts connecting through very active Facebook groups on four-shaft weaving, on pattern construction, and that's the place that people seem to find their connection through local guilds or Facebook groups these days. So this hand weaving tradition has definitely survived the professionalization of the cotton and weaving industry in Quebec that took place. So this book is an artifact of the time period where that transition was really happening. So it's interesting actually that we have the two examples. One is an individual's personal sample book of things that she created. That's the one on the right there. And the other one is a professional document that would have been internal facing. So just some notes about the professionalization period that took place. There's an interesting fond at the McCord Museum, the James Murdoch fond, and this was the papers and professional correspondence of a Scottish emigre who came to Quebec in the 1820s and started a weaving business. At the time when he arrived, he found very little in the way of professional weaving operations. And his record books and account books are an interesting resource that textile historians could go in and see the yardage that he created, the materials that he sourced, and the beginnings of that professional industry in the 1820s. He also has in that fond some pattern drafts, which are an interesting point of comparison for some of the pattern drafts that we have in the sample book here. These date, of course, from about 40 to 50 years earlier, but it's interesting that the pattern notation is still recognizable to contemporary weavers who are used to pattern drafts. So one of the things that's clear is that by the time that this sample book was made, the landscape of weaving in Quebec had changed dramatically. So this photo is actually from a little bit later. This is from the 1930s, but the site that this pictures is in Valleyfield, and it's one of the largest cotton industries, factories and producers in the country. It really shaped the area. It shaped the area. And there's actually a museum that you can visit about this particular site. But in the late 1800s, 1899 to 1900, Zéphyr Bellefleur was in operation and creating the samples that are in that book. They were made on professional looms, likely continuing in that tradition started in the 1840s and by Murdoch and other immigrants like him. In Robert Sweeney's Guide to the History and Records of Selected Montreal Businesses before 1947, he really has some interesting things to say about the cotton producers here in the Montreal area in particular. And before 1877, there were very few large mills in the area of Montreal. There were a few of note. There was the Houdon Cotton Company and the Montreal Cotton Company, which both dated from about 1874. And this is the Montreal Cotton Company's facility that you see on screen. But there was a very important shift in about 1879. John A. Macdonald, then the leader of Canada, instituted the national policy. And that gave domestic producers of cotton room to expand their businesses because it taxed international imports of cotton goods. So there was a boom in domestic cotton production localized here in Montreal. By 1885, 17 new factories and mills had been opened. And then came the era of cotton kings, which actually I'm kind of picturing toilet paper packaging when I think of that, but people called them cotton kings. So there was one by the name of Andrew Frederick Galt. He was known as the Cotton King of Canada, and he merged 7 of these new mills into one master company at the time, Dominion Cotton. And one of these companies that was merged into Dominion was the Montreal Cotton Company. And by 1900, when Zéphyr Bellefleur was producing this, he had access to a huge variety and quality of domestic Canadian cotton. So he had the goods to make all of these different weights and warps of cotton fabrics. And he was tapped into this network of Canadian cotton producers. There's a rich industrial and textile history here, and this document gives us a hint at the unique moment in time when smaller operators, like this one, still were a going concern before they were agglomerated into the oligopoly and monopoly that happened in the first quarter of the 20th century. So Dominion Cotton was formed, and then later Dominion Textiles was formed as a merger of more of those larger cotton concerns. So Dominion Textiles operated a plant in Montmorency, just north of Quebec City, at the foot of the Montmorency Falls. They used the waterfall as a power source to operate a lot of the machinery in the mill. And there was a mill in operation there for a long time. It ran well into the 20th century, ending, I believe, in the 1950s. And if you go to the foot of the waterfalls today, I believe this building is entirely gone. I don't know if anyone can chime in. I was there this summer and I realized I didn't take any pictures. So I can't give you a contemporary personal shot, but I believe the mill is gone and it's now part of a national park. But there is that industrial history here. And I bring your attention to this one in particular, because this is likely the area that this sample book is from. And I say likely because I can't guarantee it, and more research is needed into Zéphirin Bellefleur's professional network and contacts to identify the location of his mill for certain. One of the other interesting things we have here at McGill is actually the phone of labor organizer Madeleine Parent. She was a very important force in organizing the labor movements that, particularly in relation to Dominion Textiles. She was an organizer for the walkout and the strikes that occurred later in the 1930s and forward, because this monopoly really dominated the industry, and it made cotton kings out of a select few, and it made disenfranchised workers out of a lot of women and children at the time. So there's this legacy of organizing and of labor movements right here at McGill. Her phone is here. So if you're interested in exploring the textile history from that angle, we have resources on that as well. So returning to the book itself, in light of the larger industrial development, what do we know about how this book was actually used and what it actually is? So what is it? As a maker myself, with a fondness for pretty well every fiber craft, I haven't met one that I didn't like, I recognized in the sort of chaotic order of this book the hands of another person who makes things. So for those of you who do make, whether your craft is sewing, knitting, weaving, crochet, embroidery, or even crafting in the kitchen, most of us keep a record of our projects. And I found a couple of examples of this in items in the library collections, one of which is on the table. And even in a later publication from the 1930s on hand weaving, Violetta Thurston gives a helpful piece of advice saying that, quote, "It is useful to keep a warp book in which the record of every warp is entered." And she's right. It is very useful. My own project book you see on screen is not nearly as impressive as this one, nor will it weather the test of 120 years' time with the same grace. However, they have a lot in common. Every weaver or sewist keeps a comparable record, whether they use notes in an online community like Ravelry for knitting to track the projects that they make and the yarns that they use. For weavers, there is now online pattern drafting tools that you can save your projects in, as well as photos of finished materials. I used one tool called Treadle to try and draft up some of the patterns in this sample book. At a basic level, that's what we're seeing in this book. So this is a close-up of one of the pages. And this one is a cotton textile. It's created, as I said, by Zéphirin Bellefleur. And we know this partly because aside from the pages with samples like this one, they also, there's a great deal of correspondence and business records that are tipped into the sample book itself. But each page has a sample of fabric and pattern notes. And here's where math, the numbers, and domain-specific vocabulary come into play. The number of ends, the width of the reed, picks, the weight of filling, or the weft, and the warp. All of these need to be calculated and planned in order to make that specific weight, pattern, and balance of cloth. So there's a few key weaving terms to understand what we're looking at. So first, does anyone know what warp in the weaving terminology is? It's the vertical threads in the cloth. And for those of you who are also Star Trek fans, it's a useful mnemonic to think of warp as shooting off into the future, a straight line going away from you. Now, the notation in this book, they use warp interchangeably with twist as well, because your warp threads will always have to take more tension. In the process of weaving, they're the vertical threads that are weighted on a loom, and the weft are the threads that run perpendicular. So twist, that's the other notation that you'll see throughout in this book. But the warp threads run perpendicular. So I just switched them, didn't I? The weft threads, sorry, run perpendicular. So the warp threads run away from you and you shoot the shuttle back and forth, carrying your weft as filler. That's the other word that's used for weft in this particular sample book. And I think that's more of an industrial term. It's not one used as much by hand weavers. But the majority of the samples in this book will use these terms as well as picks, and that gives you the count. The ends is the number of warp threads that you have. And there's, in contemporary counts, April's going to talk about that a little bit more later, but this is the terminology used at the time for professional weavers. And you have to do a little bit of thinking and math and conversion to get that into the terms that contemporary hand weavers are more used to. So the other one that's always noted on these patterns is the reed. And I'm using a close-up of the postcard here, but that is the reed. It's like a comb, both sides closed, which fits into the beater on your loom, and it spaces the warp threads evenly, and it's also used to beat your weft into place. It looks like a comb, yeah. And the other notation that's very important is dense, and that's the number of dividers in your reed. And dense per inch is something that's the thing you need to calculate the density of your fabric. And it's interesting once you start looking at the notes, how high the number of dents is. So professional weavers, there's some that have over 2,000 in this sample book, which is extremely high. 2,000 ends, and the reed is therefore proportionately high. The number of dents in the reed is very, very high as well, because the threads are incredibly fine. So the other piece of terminology that I'll point out is the harness or shaft, which is operated by foot treadles in this particular loom. So the harness is the part that you can see above the rectangle that's framed on your screen. And that part is what raises and lowers different warp threads, and it opens what's called a shed. So once you get in, one of my favorite things about fiber crafts, honestly, is that each one has its own fun and strange vocabulary. So some of the fun terminologies of weaving are the shed, the shuttle, the warp, the weft, and the harness. So moving on from vocabulary, one of the other things, of course, this is a sample book. So each one has a labeled style, and it's only labeled numerically. Every so often there'll be other notes on style, like there may be a note that says jacquard, or a style with a specific producer of cotton or a specific producer of cloth. But generally it's simply numbered numerically, and most of the patterns in this book are not something that you would make a garment out of. There's something like this. It's a plain weave. It's mostly cotton, warp, and weft. It's toweling, or something that you would use for kitchen textiles or maybe household linens. There's some very, very sturdy cotton drills and cotton sheeting later on with the very, very high end counts. It includes a huge variety of patterns, but most of them are plain weaves like this one. It's also called a tabby weave. And essentially on the grid, you go over one warp and under the next, over one warp, under the next, and then you alternate that the next time. So it creates a very stable, very even, balanced fabric. And this one is very nearly balanced. If you look at the weight of the warp and the filling, the warp and weft on this one, you can see they're almost the same. So that creates a very even spacing across the vertical and horizontal threads. So a very even interlacing. And that's not true of all of the patterns. One of the beautiful things about weaving is you change one element, you change the weight of your warp, or you change the weight of your weft, and all of a sudden your fabric looks very, very different. So a lot of the patterns in here are plain weaves. There are also a lot of twills. And every time a twill you can recognize by the diagonal lines. So if you look at a pair of jeans, for instance, you'll see there's always a diagonal pattern, and that's your basic, very sturdy twill. And so it'll be an over under pattern once again, but with a step. So every line, that pattern will move over. So the center one is a good example. The one on the left of the screen is a mixed 12, and you can get endlessly creative with 12. So you could go backwards and forwards, up and down, depending on your treadling patterns and your own patience, I suppose. And the number, of course, of harnesses and shafts on your loom. So looking at some of those patterns, another one here have different balances. So what I pointed out earlier was the weight and weft and versus the weight of the warp. And this one here has a drastically different warp and weight balance. So the vertical threads on this one are very light. The vertical threads are this number here, labeled as 12 and 3, I think that says, cotton, yarn, twist. That's what the CY, this is my own interpretation, but I think I'm right. It's open to discussion though. If you think that there are different things that these represent, I'm welcome it. Put it in the chat and we'll talk about it. But this one, yes, the vertical threads are much lighter. So what that does is actually create a really nice pop of those weft, the horizontal threads that go over a number of warp threads. So there's a nice dimensionality to it when you change that ratio of warp to weft. What the other numbers that you see on screen on the left there, they also give you the finished weight of a yard of fabric. So that would be an interesting thing to be able to essentially reverse engineer through math to see the yardage that would have been produced by this factory, because you would want to warp a lot, that you would warp a lot and then continue producing and producing and producing. So the other very interesting part of the sample book are pattern drafts. And not everyone is interested in creating their own patterns. And I now know why. It's quite hard. So what we did is look at some of these patterns. April's going to talk about this a little bit more later on, but I'll show you some of the images. These are obviously things that the person is trying out. They're different drawing drafts, different threading drafts, and we don't know if they ever made it into actual textile samples in the book. It would require some very careful fabric analysis to see if these patterns correspond with some of the samples in the book. One of them we do know, it's pinned on. So we'll talk more about that one later, but it's an interesting thing in this book to see basically the workbook and the notes and the process of someone as they create a new style of fabric. The other thing that's in here that's quite fascinating is a little correspondence between the owner. It's one-sided, unfortunately, we don't have the replies, but between Bellefleur and a person named Jo Corriveau. And it's an interesting correspondence because it gives you a sense of how enmeshed the cotton industry was at the time. Jo Corriveau, in his first letter, worked for the Kingston Dominion Cotton Company in Kingston, Ontario. They operated a mill there as well as one in Montmorency. So Jo Corriveau worked there. He writes a letter very fondly to his friends of Bellefleur about visiting Montreal. And he says, "Je dois te dire que j'étais enchanté de ma petite promenade au Galt ou Salt." I can't quite read his handwriting. He says, "I was enchanted by my recent visit, my small trip to Galt." And at the time, Corriveau, as I said, worked at the mill in Kingston. And it shows that he had that working connection with the mill in Kingston, as well as with the other cotton companies around that are mentioned in these correspondences. He mentions Mr. Whitehead, which is likely Mr. Charles Ross Whitehead, another one of the cotton kings, if you will. He was based out of Trois-Rivières. And as an aside, we also have the architectural plans for his very elaborate mansion, which was redesigned by Nobbs and Hyde later on. So if you want to get a sense of how these cotton kings lived, you can look at the architectural plans for his home here in our collections if you're curious. But so Corriveau mentions these people. And in a letter dated only about a week and a half later, his employment situation has changed. And he's writing to Bellefleur to see if he needs a boss at his factory. And apparently he did. And so a letter dated only 2 days later, there's a negotiation about wages and about the quality of the Kingston thread and whether he should be comparing it with a different producer. which is a little suspect because clearly he just left their employment, so he might have had some bad blood. But it's an interesting little snapshot of the fact that movement happened between these major cotton companies and that this book was plugged into that network. There's actually a sample in the book of a comparison from 1898, which is actually predates that correspondence exchange, but comparing Montmorency cotton with the Kingston cloth. And this one is one of the others that has a very high end number of warp ends, 1,770, 24 dents in the reed. Its finished width is 34 inches. So it's a very fine warp and a fine cloth, but it's a sample where they're trying out the threads produced by these two different mills. The other thing that's in the book, of course, are some of the more accounting records and legal records tipped in. So accounting things for professional services and also for goods. Both of those are actually located in Quebec City, which suggests a stronger basis for the hypothesis that their mill was based outside of Quebec City in Montmorency. But yeah, that location at Bad-Sault in Montmorency, it was a town that was formerly fueled by a forestry industry, and that cotton industry was really starting to take off and take over by about 1892. So it could very well be there that this factory was located. So as we've talked about context and vocabulary, now it's time for a little more math. You ready? So what do the numbers here tell us? So one of the things I'd like to do, and will require more work, but can we figure out what kinds of machines were used in the factory by looking at these fabric samples and performing fabric analysis? So math is our key tool in the diagnostic kit, and the numbers, the bulk of what we have, can tell us or give us an idea, at least, on the number of shafts in the looms at his factory. So what do we see here? We have diagonal lines, a zigzag pattern. So it's a twill, but it's quite, for lack of another word, fluffy. You can see there's dimensionality. It almost looks raised in 3 dimensions. And you can see once again that there's quite a differential between the twist and the weft, to use the terms on screen. We know for a fact that some of the identified pattern styles were made on jacquard looms. This is not one of them, but you can see here a very fuzzy supreme close-up of that pattern, the whole page, and then my attempt at recreating it using treadle. So you can see the interlacing a little bit clearer in that pink and white image, and that software actually allows you to easily create drawing and threading drafts as well as treadling patterns as well. So that was my first attempt at recreating one of the patterns, which I chose just because it's very clear in the contrast between warp and weight ends. But coming back to jacquard, that's something that is just fascinating to think about. It's one of the precursors of modern computing. It was a programmable loom, and each line of a textile was programmed through a series of punched cards. So you could create an endlessly complex pattern programmed by a linked series of punched cards. One entire row of the cloth was contained on a linked series of punched cards. And they had some of these jacquard patterns at Bellefleur's facility. So this is one of those examples. And before I really understood what I was doing, I tried to analyze this piece of fabric, which is actually quite hard when you start. So at first I chose it because it seemed quite simple. You have a 2x2 weave in the triangle there, and then there's a totally different pattern on the right, which looked deceptively simple at first, but then when I started to try and figure out what it was with my trusty felt and graph paper, it's a repeat. It's actually not as complex as it seems, but it's a 4x4 repeat that creates a very complex textile grid with that particular weight of warp and weft. But then the real fun came in that diamond pattern. And then when I started to try and draft this up in treadle, I realized that there's no way that I could figure out the number of harnesses or treadling patterns that would be required to create so many different tie-ups on a single piece of fabric. And then I clued in, oh, this is a jacquard pattern. This would have been programmed, and each line would have been different and distinct. Because jacquard looms, you could create something that you could weave a portrait, you could weave a damask or a brocade or something very complex. In this book, most of the jacquard patterns are like this one. So interestingly textured cottons and very little color, but I invite all of you here in person to flip through yourselves at the end to see more of the different patterns. So coming back once again to math before I introduce April to give us some more contemporary examples and talk about our pattern creation process, I want to just mention all of the possibilities on, I ran across this and Sue Horton did this, investigating this question of math, how many possible tie-ups there would be if you had a 2-shaft loom. And it goes up quite dramatically. So likely on these professional looms in Bellfile's factory, they would have had 16 shafts on a loom. And therefore, there would have been 16,534 different possible tie-ups. If you had a jacquard loom, you could program all of those different ones to seemingly endless combinations to create any sort of textile sample that you would want and any pattern that you would want. So basically, you could change any element of the formula on those pages of notes and come up with a very different and drastically differently in appearance and weight, very different kinds of cloth. So I invite weavers with greater knowledge than my own to come and investigate these patterns, and to those with the knowledge to be able to read a swatch of fabric as the rest of us might read a paragraph or a line of music. I invite those people to come and to figure out the tie-ups and the harnesses and the methods used to create these samples. Now I'm going to pass it over to April, who's going to tell you more about our enthusiastic amateur process of converting some of these samples into weavable patterns. So April, as Chris mentioned, is a liaison librarian here. One of the departments that she works with is math, and she's also a fiber enthusiast. So the last time I think I worked on something with April, it was a spinning workshop, and I got to 3D print my own drop spindle and learn the basics of spinning. So April, take it away.
So thanks for having me, Jacquelyn. We spent some time with the Weaver's sample book. So I wanted to give you a little bit about my experience. The real fun part for us will be when we see how you all interact with the book. But I just want to give you a really small example of a fiber enthusiast interacting with this sample book in real life. So I had this idea to make some, I basically got inspired to looking at the draft programs to make some bookmarks. And I have a few tapestry looms, and I brought a couple with me for show and tell afterwards. But I thought it would be easier just to make a cardboard little loom that I can use to make a bookmark on. So while going through it, I also put together all of the instructions. So I took all of the dimensions. So I put the instructions together on how to make a cardboard loom and make that available to you. So at the end, I'll show you where you can get these instructions. And we also included some patterns that Jacquelyn and I put together from the book. So the first thing that I had to do to make this little loom was really just to figure out some of the math. And as Jacquelyn mentioned, I'm the math librarian, so that's the fun part for me. But I need to figure out how many ends. So how many dents, how many teeth would I need on my little loom? So what I really need to know was what was the ends per inch. And I didn't know, but as a spinner and as a knitter, what I do know how to calculate is the wraps per inch. So I just had some cotton, and if you just take a ruler and you wrap it around the ruler in an inch, it will tell you how many wraps per inch that yarn is, which is great if you're a spinner or a knitter and you have a mystery yarn and you don't know the weight of it. Is it fingering? Is it DK? You can wrap it around and then look at a little chart to see what the weight is. But what I do know is that for a basic weave, like a balanced basic tabby weave, plain weave, that your ends per inch would be about half of your wraps per inch as a good place to start. So, so I just calculated what the wraps per inch was of this little cotton to make a bookmark. And that gave me half of that would be my ends per inch. And then to know how many teeth or dents to use, would just be my ends per inch times the width of my little project. So I wanted to make a bookmark, so it's really small, and I could even double warp it, so just half of that would be fine. So this is what the numbers look like. So I did my wraps per inch and got about 20 wraps in an inch on my little ruler. And then that gives me an ends per inch of 10, so half of that. And then I just wanted a 2-inch little bookmark. So that is just 20 ends. 20 ends is really a lot. So 20 little teeth on a piece of cardboard. I'm not skilled enough to like cut 20 little teeth into a couple of inches. So you just double warp it and just make 10 ends on each side. And I'm going to show you what the little bookmark looks like. And then also I'll share that link with you if you want to make that. But that's the basic math. So the actual real fun in the math of weaving is really determining what your yardage needs to be. So how many meters do you need of your warp or your weft? And there's a lot of calculations in there because you need to do sampling first. You will have wastage, you will have shrinkage. So all of that is a lot of fun math, which unfortunately I didn't really need just to make a bookmark. I could guess that I didn't need very much yarn at all. So, but I do want to just bring your attention to these more recent videos from the Woolery. So they actually have this great Weaving Math 101 videos that will take you through all of this. There are lots of online calculators, and you can plug in your ends per inch and all of your everything that you need, the length of your loom, the width. I always think it's a great idea to sort of get a handle on the math. So that's kind of fun. So yeah, so I recommend those sort of videos. So just getting back to our sample book. So I wanted to start really small, and I started with this chain draft. So this was a little handwritten draft in the book. So I didn't use any fancy software. I just went into Word and I made a table, and I changed the color of each cell, and one for over, one for under, and I just repeated this chain draft. So it was not that difficult to bring together and put into a pattern. So then I wove this little bookmark, and I brought it in real life to show you if you're interested. And that is the front and the back. So just using that little chain draft, quickly made a little cotton bookmark on my little cardboard. And then I wanted to get a little bit more adventurous, and there was this pattern which was drafted, but as Jacquelyn mentioned, we don't know if it was ever woven. So I thought I could just translate this here into Word. So I just interpreted. What I thought were maybe mistakes. I changed the color along, and I built this little pattern in Word for a bookmark. So really just taking inspiration from those drafts and looking at the fabric and what I thought looked like flowers to me. So I made a little draft. And this is what it would look like. So still in Word, not very technical, just changing my warp and weft directions. And then I just added some color. So I wanted to see what the bookmark would look colored up. And yeah, so this is the little cardboard loom, and that is the weaving up. So this is, the cardboard is at 5 ends per inch, but it's double warped to be 10 ends per inch. And we've got the instructions here for you to download. But well, essentially I just wanted to share how to put this together. So it was really interesting, sort of as a fiber enthusiast, but not industrial weaver or anything like that, to take a book like this and really see like, how can we get inspiration from it? How can we interact with it in our sort of real life? So it was really fun to interact with. Yeah, so we'll paste the link there in the chat if you would like to download the instructions on making your own little cardboard loom. but it takes no time at all. And I think it's a great activity even for kids over the holidays. Just takes a piece of cardboard, and I brought mine to show you also. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, April. You can stay up. And now we'll have, if you have questions, we will happily revoice them for the Zoom crowd if your voice doesn't carry. So we have one in the room. Yeah, go ahead.
When you were showing images from the sample book, there was an interesting mixture of imperial and metric.
Yes.
And so I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about that.
So that one I actually welcome discussion about. The question was that there seems to be a very interesting mixture of both imperial and metric units. So if you'll forgive me, I'll flip back to a photo from the book with the notes that show that here. So yes, it does seem to be, we were discussing this actually before the event started and commenting on the fact that it seems to be that the notation that you see framed there is in grams. It seems that way. I don't know if there's another way to read that abbreviation that would, but it seems to me that they're using a combination of metric and imperial. So the weight of the finished fabric you see at the very bottom there, which is 4 pounds 90 yards, or sorry, 490 yards per pound. That's definitely an imperial. But it seems like the weight of the warp and weft is given in grams. And what we were discussing is that that's likely the weight needed for a specific length of cloth. And that's the part that we need more wisdom on. One of the audience members suggested that it could be like, that it could be per meter, like grams per meter, or it could be for a specific length or number of picks. So it's an interesting combination of the two measurement systems. And that's where the calculations to try and get from this notation to something like wraps per inch and then calculating the yardage that you would need for a contemporary project is actually quite challenging. Yeah, but it's a great question and well noted. I welcome the people who are here in the room. You're welcome to come up and look at the books themselves. You can explore, turn the pages, and look at some of these notations yourselves.
I had that same kind of issue though when I was writing up the pattern, because I'd never written one out to share before, and I'm using ends per inch, but then I'm using centimeters in my measurements because it's metric. So it's sort of, it reads a little strangely because we talk in ends per inch and always per inch, but we also measure in centimeters. It's really interesting.
Is there a Zoom question?
There's a Zoom question. It says, Linda's asking, could GR be grains? Is it even GR? Does that R doesn't look like the others? Maybe it's GS.
It could very well be. I guessed that it was R based on analyzing like more pages in the book, but it could be S.
Maybe grams?
Because if you look, there is actually an S in 5. So the line up from the bottom, it says after size. That's what a typical small case S looks like in the notation in this book, which there are a couple of different hands in the sample book, but this one is the most common, this particular hand, and you can recognize it when you start turning pages. So that's an S, which is not exactly the same as what the GR, or as I tend to read it, it could be GR or GS. But one of the fun puzzles of paleography is deciphering somebody else's handwriting.
Linda's saying, look at the S on N.
That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a little curl.
Yeah. It's very well noted. It could very well be grains. Yeah.
There was also a question about what selvages are.
Yes.
And there's some explanation already happening in the chat, which is
Yeah. So thanks for discussing in the chat. You can turn the pages. Yes, absolutely. Just touch the edges. The selvage is the 2 edges of a piece of woven cloth. And those are formed by your weft thread coming out of the edge of the piece of cloth and going under and returning through the next shed on the next side. So one of the ways that we usually hear that word today is selvage denim. That's one of the, so if you get a pair of trousers that are selvage raw denim, they actually use that edge of the woven fabric, and you'll often see a little pop. If people cuff their hems of selvage denim, you'll see the selvage on the bottom. It's kind of like this mark of ownership if you have a pair of raw denim selvage jeans. It's the way that they used to make denim using a straight side seam, which no longer is true a lot of the time. But yes, that's what the selvage is. It's created by the warp intertwining and the weft on the very edges of your fabric. Any other questions? We have 1 and 2 in the room and 1 on Zoom. We'll go with the room.
Yeah, I was wondering, because on the edges, you always have to do colors. You didn't.
I didn't, I think in this particular case, those are part of the style. But there are no particular notes on the colored warps. So that's why I didn't actually speak about it. That actually varies from sample to sample. You'll see sometimes there's blue, sometimes there's red, sometimes there's a lovely rose colored pink that's woven into some of the samples, but there is not a lot of color in this book. I think you probably noticed from my slides, there's a lot of yellow, that like aged yellow. But yes, the colors would have been warps that would have been threaded at that point on the loom to create the edge of your textile, and that pattern. But beside those colors, there's always a border of plain weave on the edge that forms your selvage. There is another from the Zoom.
Actually, on selvage, is it always parallel to the warp threads?
Yes, it'll always run up one edge of your fabric, so along the warp, the very edge of your warp.
Questions coming in here.
There's one in the room, and then we'll go back to Zoom. Yeah.
Well, thank you for it. It was really interesting and made weaving so clear because I'm fascinated by it. But I used to do embroidery, and I was in China, and they created the most fantastic embroideries using the loom. And is that the jacquard? How?
Yes, and that would have been, yes, that would have been a jacquard technology to create those complex embroidered images, essentially. That if you look at, I don't have a good photo, I'm afraid, but a brocade or a damask or a silk or something like that would have required each line to be different because there's no repetition in those images, you know. So to create and basically like paint something, you need that level of technology to be able to program line by line, warp by warp, what goes up and what goes under. And what it does as well is create a very different textile on the front and on the back. So even April's bookmarks are very different on the front and the back. I actually wove up some samples of the bookmarks too and totally forgot to take pictures of them. But you should bring those out and let people see what they look like. Because the front and back are very different. And particularly if you ever have the opportunity to see the back of one of those woven portraits and images, it's a very different color profile usually on the back.
It's identical.
Yes. And it's actually would be very interesting to translate some of these weaving patterns into embroidery samplers. It would be easier, in fact, than trying to weave them.
Okay.
Zoom?
Hilda's asking, is there a difference between how the thread/yarn manufacturer measured and weighed their products versus how the weaving company chose their measure?
I think that is a bit of a chicken and the egg situation. And what it would require is knowing more about the manufacturer. So I mentioned that network that he was plugged into. So the mills in Kingston, the ones in Montmorency, and the large mills that are centered around Montreal. What I would do to answer that question would be to dig more into the archives, particularly of Dominion Textiles, which are now at Library and Archives Canada. And you could probably find more records about Wabasso Cotton, Montreal Cotton, and these other producers that were agglomerated into Dominion Textiles. And you could find out more about what they produced, whether it was cones of wool, how they measured the products that they sold. You could look in more detail at the invoices that are included in our sample book and try and find out what he was paying for and how he ordered his goods. Because what we know from the numbers on these pages is basically the amount of materials he needed to create these samples, but with admittedly some math and some notation to calculate if he was creating a fabric that was that many pounds per yard after sizing, and it was this many inches wide, how much warp would he have needed and who would he have been buying it from and how did they sell it? Those are all the questions we'd have to dig into the accounting records to find answers to. Any more questions on the Zoom?
Yes.
Okay.
Could some of these symbols refer to the spinner's twist on the thread, Z versus S twist?
As a spinner, you want to take that one?
Yeah, clockwise or counterclockwise, especially. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I didn't really think of that. I didn't really see there.
Not every page had twist notations in this particular book. So I didn't even catch it until I had spent a fair amount of time working through the patterns. This one does. And the notation in particular for the twist, it's the 12-3-CY twist.
Oh, right.
Does that mean something different to you as a spinner? Oh, here, this part.
Why? What did you think was the one?
Well, I'm pretty sure that C simply means cotton in this particular instance. There are some samples in the book that have other textiles. The majority is cotton, but there are some with other textiles.
It's interesting because the direction of your twist is important if you're applying it, but also if you're knitting versus crochet, because you have to be careful when you knit or crochet, you untwist your yarn. So it's opposite. I don't know about weaving and twist. Interesting.
I think the most important factor is the strength of your warp yarn, because it has to take so much tension, especially in a professional loom where you're doing so many yards, so many meters, maybe even like kilometers. I don't know how long their warps would have been when they warped up a loom, because if you're warping, some of these have such a high end count. It's like 2000 or 1500. When you're warping a loom with 1500 ends, you want to do a lot of meterage to make that work worthwhile. And it's one of the reasons that, while I do love all fiber crafts, weaving, the setup required is high if you're doing something on a loom. But then once it's set up, it's a beautifully meditative craft that I really enjoy. And I quite enjoyed the small weaving as well.
Yes.
Yeah, it's less setup required. Yeah.
There's another one.
There's another one. Okay, Zoom,
Salvage
keep
is
them
a
coming.
real hot topic in the chat at the moment. So there's lots of back and forth, which is great. Rachel's asking if hand loom salvage edges are more uneven than those produced by machines, and when did machine weaving take over from hand weaving?
Well, I spoke a little bit about that transition and the fact that hand weaving persisted. The tradition definitely persisted long past the professionalization of the larger cotton industry. But like I said, the transition really, when the professional industry took off, was with that national policy that was instituted in the late 1800s. So after that, here, mills that were spinning and that were producing not only cotton, finished cotton goods, woven cotton goods, but the raw ingredients, that really took off around 1900 when this book was produced. In terms of the regularity of your edges, yes, of course, there's a difference, but a professional weaver, I mean, it would be much more regular. For a hand weaver, that's always, you aim for that regularity. And I've woven textiles myself on a rigid heddle loom, and my self edges, I might brag, they were pretty good. And it's a craft, it's an art and a craft. So yes, your self edges are something that you can be proud of. And they can also be wildly irregular. So it's definitely a matter of craft and practice for hand weavers. Yeah. So I will say an enormous thank you for all the questions on Zoom and for everyone who's here in person, who's now gathering around the items. And I think at that point, unless there's any further questions in the chat, we're going to sign off on Zoom. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen, in fact. There we go.
Can we send everyone
We can absolutely. We will send a follow-up with the recording of the event and then also the pattern link. We are working on digitizing the sample book so that you'll be able to see that on the Internet Archive, but it's a slow process because it's an interesting and unique object. So it presents unique challenges for digitization, but our team's going to be working on that. We'll have it up probably in January, but we will send out the recording and the link to the patterns and encourage you to make your own based on some of the samples in the book. Yeah.